Hi, dear listeners. This is Kate Riga. I'm here to make a quick pitch that you consider becoming a TPM Prime member. TPM has used the member model for over a decade now, and our loyal members are the only reason we've been able to weather the turbulence of the media landscape and avoid the fate that has befallen so many other independent outlets. For $70, you get no paywall, fewer ads, access to the Hive member forum, a members only newsletter, and more. For $140 a year, you get all of that plus no ads at all. Without our members, there is no podcast, not to mention that I'm out of a job. Thank you so much for listening and supporting us. We couldn't do it without you.
Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall podcast featuring Kate Riga. We are here to discuss the aftermath of the 2024 election, which we have all been living for the last week. I guess really exactly a week. Election day is on a Tuesday, but depending on how late you were up last Tuesday night when you really kind of got the full picture that Donald Trump had won another term as president. And everybody processes these things in their own way. This is not my first election being involved with this site, and one of the big ways that I do is by talking to readers, right? And talking to readers, writing my impressions of elections and so forth. So there's a lot to talk about. There's no question about that. Um, Another thing is this is actually the 24th anniversary of this website of TPM. TPM was founded on, founded is it always reads to me a little grandiose, because when I did the first post on the site, or when I quickly sort of designed the site, founded is again sounds a little more grandiose than it actually was. But yeah, the site is 24 years old. So I am also, that is in my head, and some sense of nostalgia about that stuff. On a kind of a vaguely related note, yesterday, or I guess it was actually Monday, I had lunch with Why Not Jansfeld, who is the composer of the podcast's theme song, and we got to talking about the history of the site, his uh, being a listener, a reader of the site, listener to the podcast over many years. So that's another thing I am thinking about today, and it's something for me because of where that anniversary is in the calendar. It is always something that comes up right after an election. Sometimes a good election, sometimes a bad election, but there is a lot to talk about, and I know that an election has policy implications. It has, in this case, it has a lot of implications for the future of the country. But people who care a lot about politics, uh, it's something for them to acclimate towards. And this is not any election, to put it mildly. So there's a lot of things that people are thinking about and experiencing in the aftermath of this election. I told someone a couple days ago that it took me about 36 hours for my head to clear um, after the results of the election were known. It's one of the things that, just in the nature of what I do, I've got to write about it right away. But just in my own experience, that was by Thursday of last week. I had a sense of, like, okay, I'm ready to do this new thing. Certainly not happy about it, but, like, okay, here we are. Uh, Kate Riga, my co-host. How about you? What are you making of all of this, and how, and not just what you make of it as a reporter and an analyst, but how are you experiencing it?
It's really odd. I just haven't, a lot of people around me have been heartbroken or kind of grief stricken. And I just haven't had that at all. I don't know why. I think maybe it's because on some level I was more
Prepared
prepared,
for
if
it.
not
Yeah. Yeah.
expecting it outright. Um, I feel that unlike 2016, my I've been really just a lot more kind of disgusted than heartbroken, I would say. Like, I felt much more angry than I have sad. And a lot of people have kind of expressed, disappointment that they live in a country where people would kind of choose him again. And I really don't mean to be cynical because I'm not, but I don't think I would be able to be disappointed by people at this point. I mean, just kind of doing this work and knowing deeply the informational environment that people live in and the way that they kind of make these decisions and the way that a lot of people in this country take the role of citizen very, very lightly. So that I don't know, none of this surprises me really. My biggest question, which I don't know if we'll ever know the answer to, is it Trump in particular, or was this a thermostatic, I'm pissed about affordability election, and they kind of would have swung to whoever was in the other column? It doesn't matter. It was Trump, right? But in that way, it just feels a little less painful to me because I think 2016 was so painful. Like it felt physical. The idea that so many people would put a man like this in the office, especially as a woman. But by this point in my life and my career, you know, people's kind of disdain for women to indifference is nothing new or shocking to me. So, I guess on some level, it bums me out that people are still so unwilling to vote in their own self interest. But, beyond that, I guess I'm just not surprised. I'm more kind of the toughest thing that I'm working through is I'm feeling a little preemptively exhausted about how draining a Trump administration is on every level, right? I mean, it's hard from a workflow perspective because there are weird hours, things happen all the time because he just isn't someone who would have a schedule, and things are generally so chaotic around him that during the Biden administration, you knew when things were going to happen, you knew when people are going to talk to reporters. You don't get that in a Trump administration. That impulsivity also comes with, fear, right? That he's going to do something crazy and off the cuff. There's that piece of it. And then there's just the moral exhaustion, right? Of watching one of the worst people America has ever produced getting a second term and getting one with the majority of American voters kind of desiring that outcome. So, I think it also leaves you with a little bit of a different feeling that maybe you felt in 2016 too, Josh. Like, I just remember people were just wanted to spring to their feet and kind of protest, right? I mean, the Women's March was the clearest example of that, but there was this sense of like, yeah, he became president, but he did it in this kind of cheating way almost. Most people didn't want him to be president. And a lot of people were excited about the first woman and all that combined into this kind of like need for action. And that is completely lacking as far as I can tell this time. And in part, it makes sense, right? You can't say there was any kind of illegitimacy of this presidency. He won it by every metric. And I think that's okay for now. And I think people need to take a break and you can't just be battered by this stuff all the time. I totally get that. But I'm a little bit worried that that disconnect will prove more pervasive because as much as people in both parties love to kind of make fun of the hashtag resistance, like it had results last time. It's
Mhm.
hard for me to see Trump's presidency being quite as unsuccessful as it was if not for people paying really close attention and translating that into activism. You think of that especially around like ACA repeal or the Kavanaugh confirmation. Like those were huge news events because people rose up in opposition. And I'm a little worried that we're headed into an administration where people are much less willing to put in that kind of emotional energy this time.
Yeah, it's funny, the making fun of the resistance is something that, well, it has been a backdraft of our politics for the last 8 years. And I think we all know there are certain aspects of it that were a little corny, a little, I don't know, over the top, or like there isn't any political movement or something like that. But I also think that it's part of that contempt that a lot of elite culture and a lot of the press has for Democrats. And I did a post about this. I don't know, yesterday, Dave. I can't remember exactly when. Um, that there is this a lot of these postmortems aren't just contempt for the candidate, for Joe Biden, for the leadership. And look, leadership is an accountability enterprise. You lose the election, like you were in charge. Who else are we going to blame, right? Um, and that's, we can talk about that. But a lot of those postmortems, again, the contempt is really for Democrats, the people who make up the votes for Democrats. And in a lot of those, talking about a lot of those postmortems, talking about the resistance, often it's like resistance moms. That what it's really about is women,
Mhm.
resistance women, and all the like, oh, all the all that whining about this, about Trump, about abortion, about whatever. And again, every every political formation has its excesses, its cliches, and stuff like that. Um, but who, you know, who do we feel more contempt for? The people who supported Trump, or the people who kind of couldn't be bothered, or the people who got really riled up and said, I this is not okay with me. I'm gonna sort of put my all into this. That's a revealing thing. And I think a lot of that resistance stuff is pretty, a lot of that kind of contempt for that world, that thing, is very, very gendered. I think when most people talk about the resistance, they're talking about women. They're not mainly talking about men. Um, so that is that is one part. There's something that the point you made about people willing to kind of march on day one, right? All that kind of stuff. I think I have some of the same concern that that you have, but one thing that makes me not have, that makes me confident that muscle memory is there, is something David Kurtz actually said to me. I don't know, in the first, probably before Trump was even sworn in the first time, but after the election. And some of it was in part about the public reaction, even our staff's reaction to Trump being elected. And I think you see it in some of those first, the protests they had at the airports when they were, introducing the Muslim ban. I think there was an inchoate sense, maybe not a completely uh, conscious or explicit sense, that this is so fucked up. If we all just say no and go to the airports and have a big march, maybe he won't be president anymore. Maybe it'll be clear this is so crazy that it'll all fall apart. Um, and I remember when he said that, I think, and he said rightly, that I don't think people get this is not going to end in any. We're not going to kind of have a public freak out, and he's not going to be president anymore. This is, and of course he was right, and I suspect that if you would put the question to the vast majority of people who were doing those protests, they would have said the same thing. It's not that I don't think a lot of people were thinking he was going to like resign in like February or something like that. But I do think some of that right out of the gate thing was kind of based on that because it didn't just seem so crazy. It was so crazy that this had happened. It was very shocking that it happened, which it was. And so I think some of that, people, not jumping for marches and stuff like that, is a recognition. Like, okay, this is what we got. 4 more years of this, and that's obviously, on the one hand, incredibly sobering. And there's that challenge of exhaustion that I think Democrats face, but there's also a sense of kind of like you got to pace yourself. It's we're not gonna we collectively are not going to either lose a step on this or upend this by what we do in the first week. This is a marathon.
Yeah, and I think it doesn't preclude the possibility that when he does something awful, whether it be kind of the enactment of the mass deportations or what have you, that people won't kind of get smacked in the face with the reality of Trumpism, and then that won't kind of set off the resistance libs again. But I just think rightfully there's a sense of like, you people want him, right? You want him, you get him. I mean, I think that most people made this decision in a pretty superficial way. I don't think that a lot of the most people who voted for Trump really spent a lot of time thinking about it, and I think that's a shame and one of the worst parts about our country. But at this point, it almost feels like, well, you got to let him fuck up, right? You got to let him do what he's going to do, so people kind of are reminded with these like Nat-like memories of what he is and what it's like having a chaos agent as the president. And then, you muster the forces for 2026 and try to, take the House back. The Senate is difficult again, but at least you take the House back and then you somewhat can kind of stem the bleeding or stem what he's able to do. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the best battle cry I can like muster at this point.
Yeah, and again, I don't think. I mean, I do think that exhaustion issue is a real one, is a very real one. And it's funny, someone pigeonholed me in an elevator a couple days before the election, and they said, and so obviously before we knew that this was the result. And when I think a lot of Democrats were at least cautiously optimistic that Trump would lose. And this person said, like, they said we had to, save democracy in 2020, and we did it. Right. We elected Joe Biden and whatever. And now it's back 4 years later, and we're having to do it again. And this person said to me, like, I feel like we were lied to. or that someone messed up, someone blew it, and they need to be held accountable. Um, and I- you know, my take on this is a little different. That people's expectations were it was people were given a misleading set of expectations. And what I said to this person is, I said, look, as long as you have, you know upwards of 50% of the country that wants someone like Trump, it's not a one and done thing, right? It's um just that. It's not a one and done thing. And I think I wrote a piece, I don't know, like a year ago, 2 years ago, something like that, that I think we're in an era now where you have one sort of populist authoritarian party and one civic democratic party, and that has an overlap with left and right, but it's not just left and right. And if that is true, then winning every election forever is not a viable strategy. And so, um, I said some version of that to this person, but it did remind me that I think that people were that was a false expectation.
Yeah, and I think in a landscape of kind of bullshit recriminations and over the top flagellating that only Democrats could do, where I think there is real cause for anger and hopefully energy for change is this idea that you tell everyone you got to vote for your guy in 2020 to save democracy. They do it. You get a trifecta, a narrow one, but a trifecta. The fact that Democrats didn't do absolutely everything to pass pro-democracy reforms, if nothing else, then for the DOJ to go after Trump day frickin' one and hold him accountable for January 6th. I mean, that's a huge abdication. And I want to be fair in terms of, Democrats were working with Manchin and Sinema, right? Like that was always going to complicate things. But all of my pre-write duties, which is, our term for when we get a piece ready to go before an election, right? Like this year, Josh Kavinsky and I split duties, and he did the Trump win stuff, and I did the Kamala win stuff. So all my hard work is never going to be seen. But what I was trying to nail down in that piece is Trump has been repudiated again. Is this the end of Trumpism? And, everyone I talked to was like, well, no, right? Especially if she won by a narrow margin, which seemed the most likely if she did win. The Republicans aren't going to take from that this is not like a winning formula, right? They're going to be like, well, we just came up a little bit short. It's a lot easier to double down on that and to hope for a better, hypothetical atmosphere next time than to do what would be the really hard work of cutting the chain of the wagon from Trump and refiguring out what a kind of policy less party stands for and how to make it attractive to a wide swath of people. So, and everyone I talked to was like, Democrats have got to kind of use their power maximally when they have it to put in guardrails. And again, I'm not going to, I hate when people do this revisionist history stuff of like, they had a trifecta and they didn't do anything. Like, first of all, that's not true. Second of all, they had really difficult obstacles. But that being said, Biden didn't get on board with filibuster reform for about a year and a half. And by that point, Manchin and Sinema were dug in a way that honestly they might not have been if you hit the ground running. You say, we're doing a carve out and we're going to, shore up the Electoral Count Act. We're going to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. We're going to try to kind of get some guardrails in place. Meanwhile, the DOJ is going, balls to the wall. They are not going to keep Trump a non-indicted co-conspirator, right? They are going to name him, and they are going to do so aggressively. And that just wasn't there, right? Like the attitude from Biden on down was, we don't want our administration kind of bogged down in relitigating the Trump stuff yet again. We want to turn the page. We have these really exciting policy proposals, this big comprehensive plan, which, as we know, they managed to put an incredible amount of into law, and it is actively making people's lives better. But I think Democrats just sometimes forget that the marketing is as important as the product, and B, are trying to market, they're trying to market Pepsi in like the Coke headquarters. So it's just, there's also the built-in difficulties, but that's a place where I'm really okay with the recriminations. Like, institutional Democrats have been so scared and so wimpy for a long time, and there's got to be a wake up call there. Like in these pieces I'm talking to people about kind of, will a filibuster reform be able to pass, and it's this big open question, and it's like, that's a nibbling around the edges stuff. And we're in a place now where probably Alito and Thomas at least are going to retire. If not John Roberts, I think that's an open question. Trump is going to appoint like
I hadn't even really
30. I
thought
know,
about John Roberts. Yeah.
that horrifying thought just occurred to me yesterday. But Trump's going to put in some like 30-year-old ideologues from the Federalist Society. I mean, that's the court for a generation. So when Democrats get power again, they have got to add seats. Like, they've got to do the big reforms that are going to have Republicans howling, that is going to have the mainstream press accusing them of shredding democratic norms. And they are going to have to get themselves into a place where they can withstand that backlash and say, no, fuck that, come up with some kind of messaging thing about how, well, the framers actually wanted 15 justices or something. Like, find a way to be
Well,
like,
and the biggest way is to run on it,
right.
because that's, that is the, it, in some ways that's what Trump did. I mean, you're not going to be able to say like, hey, where's this mass deportation stuff come? No one voted for that. Like, well, okay. I mean,
Right.
they whether they really voted for it, like, I don't think a majority voted for that, but like they didn't keep it a secret. It was like a chant at their convention. So by any but I 100% agree, first of all, with that, because I see, you see these headlines, people saying Supreme Court is locked up for a couple generations. Well, okay, I can't accept that. And I don't think anybody should accept that, because that is not a viable path forward. So 100% agree with you that starting right now, it's just got to be assumption. The next time you have complete control, you add numbers to the court, because it is not viable to say that, all right, you're going to have a kind of a Republican owned Supreme Court until 2055. That's just that's not legitimate. And I think you also have to have a system. um there are all these kind of different, just add a few more people. I think you want to come up with something that is actually viable as a new system. And I think that system is, there's a 10-year term, and probably maybe you have 15 justices or 20, and somewhat the way they do at the circuit court level on different cases, there's 9 for each case. And so each case has a different mix of people. And again, 10-year terms. And so that's the kind of thing. I'm not sure just saying, okay, it's 9, let's go to 15 and we get 6. Now it's all, okay, that's not, then they're going to add another, you know what I mean? It's not exactly viable. I think it is worth coming up with something that you can see becoming a new thing. But yeah, it's not, it is absurd to think, okay, guess we just, elections have consequences. And so it's, those are, you can't accept that. And I completely agree on filibuster reform. And on the issue of recriminations, I mean, my point is not when I'm when I'm kind of anti recriminations. It's you can have as many recriminations as you want for the people who made the big decisions. It's what, like, sort of what I said
Totally.
about running for president. It's a no excuses enterprise. The prize is you become the most powerful person in the world. And if you lose, you lose. What is John Kerry's epitaph? He ran for president and he lost. And that's how it goes. It's more, I in my mind, at least, it is we shouldn't just have it be a free fire zone where everybody jumps up and takes a moral high ground based on what was always their hobby horse the whole time. And I'm like, okay, great. You always thought X, and now you're gonna sort of like, oh, not my fault. Well, a lot of people are at fault here, and but on my way of thinking, the big even more than the democracy reform stuff, which I agree, more of that should have happened, but on the indictments and the accountability for January 6th, that stuff is just, it is, people argue, and I think it is factually true. They didn't blow this off for 2 years. They were working on it pretty much from the beginning, but that's not a good answer. Something that you cannot bring even with the fact that the Supreme Court meddled as much as it did. The fact that you cannot bring these kind of cases to completion in 4 years, you did something wrong. I don't care what the explanation is. You did something wrong. That is too long a period. That's an absurdly long period of time. And I think we know the big story, that it is people like Merrick Garland are just not of the mind that you come in and say, as a policy priority, we need to hold people responsible for what happened on January 6th. And not just the people who just, on the basis of video evidence, we know went in and like smashed a statue. And so obviously that's open and shut. That I think what we know from the best reporting we have is they said, look, we're going to take this from the ground up. We're just going to, kind of start with what we know. We know that there were people storm the Capitol, and we'll kind of, follow where the evidence leads us. And in a different era, in a different reality, that may make sense, because there are 100 good reasons why you want to be really careful about indicting the people you beat in the last election. But we're not in that reality now. And look, it is entirely possible there's a different reality where Trump was, indicted in, I don't know, late summer 2020, 2021, charged, sentenced, even ran out his appeals. And then, or maybe he still had some appeals going on. Then he was reelected president, and kind of like, that is entirely possible. But that is a different, reality. And I think where, one big screw up on the, Biden administration's part writ large is that I think they thought they had turned the page. And I think part of that was actually that January 6th was such a mammothly discrediting thing. Like, I suspect they thought, it's one thing if, he loses and sulks off or whatever. And January 6th was terrible, but like, he put an exclamation point on what a huge fuck up and disaster and danger he is. And like, even Republicans kind of see it, which they did briefly, either for a few days, or even in some cases, he was sort of toxic for a few months. but they were wrong. They were wrong.
Totally. Like, to me, it's three-pronged, right? The things that I think are deserve recrimination and deserve action to fix. One is the Supreme Court, because doesn't matter if, a Democratic president wins by an electoral landslide and with a huge mandate from the people, Democratic presidents don't get to use any unilateral authority with this Supreme Court in place. They will just never be able to do anything big through that. And that's a huge hamstringing of their power. Two is the filibuster. I mean, I think people will always say, well, Republicans will pass terrible stuff and it'll be awful. And that might be true, but there's a reason that Mitch McConnell has let the filibuster, be in place and has been such a kind of staunch defender. And it's because he knows that it serves Republican interests. They can still do tax cuts and they can do judges with it in place. And it prevents Democrats from ever actualizing huge amounts of the ideological agenda because they can't shove it through reconciliation. And I think it has really hurt Democrats to not get power and say, hey, we're passing abortion protections. Boom, do it. We're raising the minimum wage. Boom, do it. And then the third thing is, I've written about this, but it's just the information environment, because the first two, I think, help immeasurably in giving Democrats easy things to point to, that you don't have to kind of wade through the Build Back Better bill to try to teach people about its disparate parts. But that doesn't matter if 3/4 of the country is still awash in either explicit or implicit right-wing propaganda all the time. Democrats have got to start competing on this level of quote unquote kind of cultural content that is shot through with right-wing ideology. And those are the places that I think attention should be given. Activism should be applied. We can't just keep having these same kind of old guard Dems who love the Senate or worship the institution of the Supreme Court. You need people who are kind of creative and agile and aggressive and not afraid to wield power when they finally get it back again.
I think one thing that, to your point, and a way, what sort of broadens out the scope of that is that in some key ways, and I'm certainly not the only one to say this, that the sort of the kernel of Trumpism, or the sort of the originating thing behind it, is people don't trust institutions. They have broad distrust of institutions, who runs all this kind of stuff. And this is what has always made gridlock and stonewalling so makes it work so well for Republicans, is that you not only stop all the things that Democrats want to do, but you also create a climate of cynicism. Like, we voted for these people. What happened? We voted for you, and why did this thing not happen? So that is, and even Kamala Harris made it kind of a centerpiece. I win and we get Congress, man. We're doing Roe nationwide. It's happening. And if you were kind of paying attention, it came up kind of late in the campaign. People started canvassing senators, like, are we good with this? Like, if we hold the Senate, like, are we going to do this? And people are like, well, do we have to? Like, filibuster, maybe it'll come, as you were saying, right? And that disconnect between elections and outcomes is the kind of moist substrate in which the sort of the toxins of cynicism and pervasive lack of trust originate. So even when people say, like, well, if we don't have a filibuster, Republicans will do stuff. Well, yes, and that sucks, but that's democracy. And the other reason that Mitch McConnell liked the filibuster is that people like him knew. It's handy to have there because some of the
Exactly.
batshit stuff that our people are going to want to do will say like, there's the filibuster. Hey, sorry. We got the
Wish we
filibuster.
could.
Yeah, wish we could. Would love to be doing that. Every woman has to produce, 3 live offspring by the time she turns 30. But just if the filibuster weren't there, we'd be all over that great idea. That as much as there is damage, you vote for crazy people, crazy stuff happens, and then you come back 2 years later and you get rid of the crazy people. That is now, and my point is not, well, you gotta break a few eggs if you're going to make an omelet. Not to get into my fertility metaphor here, but the old Stalinist line. But look, I think we see now that Trump will find a way around these things. At the point at which they decide they want to get rid of it, they'll get rid of it. So I don't even think that is that. People who believe in government have an interest that people who don't believe in government don't have in, again, tethering elections to outcomes. I motivate, I turn out, I organize, my side wins an election, and then these things happen that are the outcomes of that. And if people don't like them, then there's a counter reaction. And that has been, that tether has been cut in critical ways. I mean, we saw it with even something like student debt relief. Biden ended up, I mean, he did it like 10 different ways, and it kept getting shot down. To Democrats would think, well, Republicans put on the Supreme Court. I mean, Biden's trying. But I think to a great extent, the political victim of that was Biden.
Mm-hmm.
No one, because in a way, of course it is. People aren't going to think, well, God, you voted for John Thune back in 2004, and then you got this Supreme Court guy, and the Supreme Court guy, come on, really? No one thinks that way. This is, of course they don't. Joe Biden said he would do this, and he wasn't able to do it. And so you have to have that. That tether has to be there.
Which is another really strong data point in favor of when the thing that's holding you back is, procedural bullshit that basically no one outside of these really intense political junkie circles knows about. It shouldn't even be a hesitation to get rid of it. And look, to some degree, I understand that the Democrats' institutional reverence is not always a bad thing. Like, that's what inoculates the party from Trumpism to some degree, right? Like, having this kind of faith in government and, belief that its institutions should be robust and upheld. But at some point, you got to open your eyes and be like, okay, no one knows what the filibuster is who is not a political reporter, but they do know that Biden ran on getting rid of student debt and they still have all their student debt, right? I mean, it's the kind of thing where Democrats just got to get a little more comfortable in reforming stuff that is unilaterally hurting them at this point. And I think you make a great point too with the whole let Republicans run on what they promised, like there's a reason that they still are a minoritarian party to a large degree. And that's because they have not done any kind of work to develop policies that are broadly appeal to people. And that's why they've got to mask it in other stuff, right? That's why you had George W. Bush win in 2004, take his mandate and go on to try to privatize Social Security, which he'd never mentioned to anyone before. And then, get basically walloped from that in Katrina. But I think a lot of the recriminations we've seen are stupid, and, relitigating the Harris campaign is like dumb for all kinds of reasons, including that it was so short. But, while we're kind of looking under the hood, this stuff needs to be fixed. And it's glaring even on the kind of smallest of levels. Like, I remember doing all this reporting when it was time for the debt ceiling again, which our listeners will know people or Republicans only care about when there's a Democrat in the White House. And I'm going around asking people, you know, Liz Warren has this proposal to raise it to $1 gajillion, get rid of it, like take it out of their sheath. They're the only ones who weaponize it. And people are like, oh, I don't know. I don't know, just kind of like nervousing around and being like, well, we've had it a long time, maybe it's important. And it's like, God, those people have got to either get pushed out of the party or grow up a little bit, because what would you rather have? Would you rather have the filibuster and the debt ceiling and these other concepts that no one outside of DC and New York has ever heard of? Or would you rather have easy to understand, populist deliverables that next time you run, you can say, I did X, Y, and Z for you of these easily understandable things, and I am now going to build on it. And you have no reason to doubt that I'll do that because I just did these other things.
100%. And just to beat a dead horse about the filibuster is not even a real thing, and it's not a good thing. We will come up against various ideas over the next 4 years, over the next 8 years, hopefully as Democratic president in 4 years, where you say, all right, we're going to need to push the envelope a little on certain things because we're in a pushing the envelope era. And that's there you get into some real questions, right? The filibuster isn't like that. The filibuster was always a minoritarian thing. It was historically used almost always for bad things, affirmatively bad things. It really has its life from the need of the American South to have an effective veto over certain things at the federal level. And it is something that if you want to actually talk about the Constitution, the people who wrote the Constitution knew there were certain things where they said, look, we need a supermajority for certain things. And it's not enough to just on a majority vote. They didn't set it up this way. This was not the plan. This was affirmatively not the plan. There's nothing good about this thing. There's nothing you're saving about this. It's a bad thing. So even on those terms, it's not like, well, this was always a good thing, or it's rooted in the Constitution. It's not. It's like a fake thing. So that is an even bigger reason why you should just get rid of it. It never should have existed in the first place.
Yeah. I said also people outside of New York and DC don't know the filibuster. I know that our listeners hail from near and far, and all of you know well what the filibuster is, but just speaking broad strokes. But the reason why I'm like nervous that Democrats are just going to plod on the same kind of path than they have been. And when I say Democrats here, I'm kind of talking about the elites, the institutional ones, the ones who wield power, are for two reasons. One, someone asked Durbin about Sotomayor stepping down in the lame duck and getting replaced, right? This has been kind of bubbling up in the conversation a bit. She's 70, she's diabetic. You hate to do these kind of like actuarial tables for people, but it's the
These
kind
of
hard.
Yeah,
it's the ruthless truth of having a lifetime appointment. And someone asked Durbin about it and he said, oh no, it's not realistic. We're not talking about that kind of thing. And it's like, maybe there are impediments to doing that. Maybe Manchin and Sinema would be like really eager to kind of stick it to Democrats one last time. I don't know. But it's classic, right? This kind of preemptive, we haven't even tried yet, but we're already giving up kind of thing, layered with this notion that it's uncouth to even talk about it. It's kind of it's disrespectful. It doesn't behoove someone of her stature. And like, look, I love Sotomayor. Like, I think she's a great justice. I think her specific niche of kind of bringing like real world suffering into these right-wing hobby horse cases is invaluable. However, that doesn't mean that a very young, healthy liberal justice wouldn't vote the same way that she votes on everything, wouldn't be a valuable voice on the court. At some point, it can't be about this like hagiography to these figures. It has to be about getting and keeping power, which is something that Democrats just, they act like it's beneath them, right? Again, like it's uncouth. Like it's not something they should talk about. So that's like one data point. And then the other is Schumer initially was not inviting either of the Pennsylvania candidates to the Senate for orientation because that race has been called by AP, but then some stuff came out where the AP was like, oh, damn, we didn't realize there were quite this many ballots outstanding when we made the call, and no networks have replicated it yet. So you do get a real sense of there's more to go here, and it's a close race, and it's coming down to kind of provisional ballots and stuff that comes in late and that's counted slowly. Schumer was not inviting anyone. The Republicans started doing this whole election fraud. This is election fraud. Bob Casey isn't conceding. Didn't you just spend 4 years yelling at us for this? And now you're doing the same thing. But obviously bad faith bullshit, right? Like Bob Casey is not storming the Capitol. He's just saying like, I don't know, maybe we count all the votes in a really close election before we decide the winner. And guess what? Schumer caved. Guess who was at orientation? Dave McCormick, before that race has been like really settled. And it's just that kind of stuff where
I didn't even know that. The last I had heard is when he didn't invite him. So
yeah.
I mean,
no, he was there. And it's just like, you guys got to grow up, and you have got to be able to start detecting when the blowback you're getting is unbelievably bad faith and start learning to ignore it.
100%. I think another thing, and this is something we've talked about at other points in the podcast, and it comes into play, especially with the Senate. Senate is an elite by definition and intention, an elite institution. But what you see, and maybe to some degree Republicans have their own version of this that they feel Republican voters feel. There is a pattern where Democratic senators, the sort of the top senators, feel that they are a little higher in the altitude or a little more rare. The concerns of Democratic voters are a little beneath them, right? You got bigger fish to fry here. This is the United States Senate and all this kind of stuff. And that is, first of all, that's not true at a basic level. But you can't get people all riled up about the consequences of elections and then be dismissive of their attitudes and concerns. And it's not just it's not just unfortunate or kind of you shouldn't do that. It's something that breeds cynicism. Because if these things are really that important, then they're that important, right? Things about, I mean, it's stuff like whether you're going to pass a Roe law. You say, well, okay, hey, this is the Senate. There are realities. Well, fuck that, man. Like, and you see it with, I don't know, pick on Dick Durbin here, but a lot of senators, they've been there for a long time. Again, it's designed to be an elite institution. There's a reason it is like that. But you can't, when you get people really riled up, and look, I believe that basically all of those senators there really believe in abortion rights. They think it's important. I don't think they're lying when they're saying, hey, bodily autonomy is on the line in this election and everything. But if you believe that, you have to act that when it comes to making basic decisions about what you're going to do in the Senate. And that disconnect, and now it's about abortion. It's about, it's been about other things. That is toxic because, again, it does that. It creates that disconnect. That's why you and I at various points, you put together that, kind of updating infographic in 2022 about, where different senators are on the filibuster, with an eye towards passing a Roe law. Obviously, this is just after Dobbs. You have to, that tether has to be there. If people think, wow, I really do have to vote, and maybe I'm pissed about prices, but I'm sick of this. I'm sick of hearing about these women bleeding out in hospitals in Texas. So fuck that. I'm going to vote for the Democrats because we need to get this done. You can't expect people to follow that chain of logic if you're kind of coming back after the election and say, well, okay, look, there's realities that are, realities in the Senate that are hard to understand. Well, if they're, then leave. Get us someone who doesn't understand those realities, like us, who will just go and do it. And because those realities are just, I don't know. I don't think these folks, the great majority of them, I think, really believe in these policy priorities. I don't think they grasp the toxic and corrosive nature of that behavior on the possibilities for democratic action in this country. Just reality.
Exactly. So before we wrap up, we're just going to briefly kind of talk about Trump's early cabinet appointments, which have been coming out fast and furious.
Very fast.
Yeah. They include putting Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy in charge of like a kind of made up little meme agency that is hilariously enough two kind of co-administrators in charge of reducing government inefficiency, which is a neat little kind of like New Yorker joke all wrapped up in one there. You've got Susie Wiles is going to be his chief of staff, which is I think the biggest real kind of grown up decision that he made. You've got Elise Stefanik is UN ambassador. You've got Lee Zeldin as EPA administrator, which is so random, like
He'll
at
have
least
to
last
find out
time
what
it
the
was
EPA does.
exactly. I mean, last time it was at least a coal baron, right? Like that makes sense. But yeah, I mean, and we were talking before we started recording, Josh, and you pointed out that an awful lot of the appointments so far have just been kind of stooges, right? Like loyalty people who are going to kind of do whatever he wants, much more than largely you have kind of ideologues in charge of a department that they are kind of hell-bent on,
Destroying,
unraveling. Exactly. And then last night, Trump made his first kind of like big bombastic appointment, which was Pete Hegseth, this Fox News host, as defense secretary, right? So that's kind of the first, I'm just going to pluck someone out of the MAGA sphere to be in charge of one of the big three.
And big three for him.
Mm-hmm.
Like for a Democratic president, State Department is big, right? That's a big thing. It's never that big for Republicans, and especially not for Donald Trump. But hey, if you want to use the U.S. military against American civilians, you got to have you got to have a tight relationship with the guy in charge of the Pentagon. So I mean, it's a it's a big pick for him, right? It's always a pretty big pick, but especially for Donald Trump.
Right. And that, I think, is when you're starting to encroach in the land of why he wants to do recess appointments, right? E.g., he's concerned that even with, not a huge, but a sizable looking Republican majority in the Senate, he's not going to be able to get these confirmations through. Those first early picks, you were like, these people will all probably be fine. Like you could see these picks more or less in a more normal Republican cabinet. But that's one where you're starting to get into like, okay, when reporters told Lisa Murkowski, she was like, really? Like shocked, So, oh, and of course we should mention Kristi Noem, DHS.
Right,
Guess the
right,
dog
right.
shooting thing didn't end up being disqualifying for her
Hey,
after all.
dogs pose their own threat to this country and the homeland. You need someone
Cricket
who is
got
not
what
gonna
was coming to
not
him.
yeah, not going to feel they have to hold back from doing what is necessary to protect the homeland from the dog menace.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what's your sense right now? I think that going into this, the big question has been like, we know his administration will be somewhere on the gradient from kind of like malevolent, break everything in American democracy, to so chaotic that relatively little gets done. With these early picks, like, where are you feeling kind of on that sliding scale?
I would say it's at least a bit different than I think most people were anticipating. And like when you say anything like that, certain people will think you're making excuses or saying, "Hey, it's not so bad," or something like this. It's not one or the other. It's that aside from Hesketh, and he may, in a sense, also be in this category. You're not. He's not appointing ideologues. He's not really appointing people, at least from one big part of the MAGA cinematic universe. He's appointing people who have made clear to him they're up for whatever he's game for. Like Elise Stefanik, she was kind of a new kind of Republican, Harvard Institute of Politics, all this kind of stuff, until she realized there's no future in that. And she became like a hardcore MAGA, Trump BFF. And Rubio's the same thing. He's a pre-Trump guy. Um, but Trump broke him, and now he's kind of he's again, he's up for whatever Trump wants. And that's the defining thing here. And again, this Pete Hesketh guy for defense, that's kind of in a different category. But like Kristi Noem, here's that Republican who was in the House and then got elected to governor. And again, she's just someone who's up for whatever. Um, and that is that shows where he's going, and it's not totally surprising to me, but again, it's kind of different. And we're going to have to see, but that it is worth taking cognizance that is clearly an emerging pattern. I mean, there are still, it sounds like he's going to fire Chris Wray. That doesn't even seem to be at this point. That's not even being questioned as far as I can tell. He's going to push Chris Wray out. And as we know from his first term, you can do that. President can do that. So you have things like head of the Justice Department, head of the FBI, head of the Treasury, which obviously is going to run the IRS. So there's some very big appointments that are still to come. But you can see, and Susie Wiles, as you said, shrewd of him. That makes sense for him. They've got a working relationship, which he appointed people last time he didn't even know. And he's been working with her for a year and a half. That it works as a working relationship. I'm sure he thinks, not without some reason, that she got him elected. So that makes sense. That's going to push towards, helping them get through things they want to do, and will probably at least limit the kind of, parade of unforced error, just complete nonsense. Not when like you're I'm sure they realize if you're going to do mass deportations, there's going to be a lot of costs and a lot of bad press. And they're thinking, well, okay, but fine, but we want to do it and we're going to do it. But in many ways, the defining thing about his first presidency is just bad press for just nonsense, just things that were not anything, just stupid things. So That's my sense. That part is a little different than I think most people anticipated, to an extent from what I anticipated, and Democrats need to take cognizance of that, because that may lead to fewer unforced errors than we had in the first term.
I totally
I mean, he's still
agree,
Trump.
and
He's still Trump,
right. That's the
and that's
thing,
gonna
right? It's
that's
like
it. Yeah,
Wiles was working with him for this campaign. She was working with him when he was in exile to Mar-a-Lago previously to this. And there's only so much someone can do when it's Trump, right? I think
yep,
also a piece of this, I totally agree with you. I think she'll, you know, grease the skids. I think she'll help put a kind of adult face on things. But something like if they do carry out mass deportations the way they said they're going to, I don't know that kind of the best PR apparatus in the world is going to help all that much just because it's so
absolutely,
unprecedented
absolutely, absolutely,
from both
absolutely.
a kind of a logistics and an optics perspective,
Yep,
right? But
yep,
in
100%.
addition to that, we've got what Stephen Miller is going to be a deputy chief of staff or so we knew he'd kind of weasel in some spot of prominence and he did. I think on the immigration things, actually that's where things are grimmest. You have
Mhm.
Thomas
Totally agree.
Homan is going to be the border czar, and he is an ideologue. Like he was kind of the mastermind behind family separation last
Mhm,
time. This is his bread
mhm.
and butter. Which is an indication that I think maybe they will try to carry this out on some mass scale. And I think that's been a bit of an open question. Like Trump himself was kind of all over the map when he was talking about it, right? And occasionally they would slip into a more palatable, we're only going to get criminals or we're only going to get kind of recent people.
Wasn't that JD Vance, I think, actually in the debate when Tim Walz sort of hit him on mass deportation? I think I'm remembering this. I mean, I know he said this at one point. I think it was during the debate, where he responded like, "Look, kind of in essence, like, oh, let's put this like whatever that mass deportation issue. Like, yeah, presumably we can all agree that if you've committed crimes here, you should be deported." And I'm sure, and most people, well, the reality is, if you are adjudicated for a crime in the United States, you get deported really fucking fast, actually, because I know people who work in the immigration world, and like, if you get convicted of a crime, you're done. Basically, you serve your sentence and you're out. So that happens, but he clearly wanted to frame it in a way that most people would say, yeah, I mean, God, if you're here undocumented and like hold up a 7-Eleven, yeah, you're gone. We don't need you here. You're not, so he at a critical moment was not willing to defend it, and I think you're right. That raised real questions. Or like, is it just going to be a sort of like, we're going to say like, oh, yada yada yada, but just it's the same old yada, not. But no, it seems like they're serious about at least some dramatic escalation of how this is done in the United States.
And that's going to be I just think it'll be tough for him to weather because you see reporting that people have done specifically on immigrant communities. And they're like, well, he's not talking about me. I didn't do any crimes. I came here to
Yep.
work hard. It's like, well, guess what, babe? He's considering if you kind of tie in everyone who's undocumented, that includes people who are married to US citizens, right? That includes parents of children who were born here. Like things get real ugly real fast when you kind of expand past what I think it would not be that feasible in reality. Cause I think kind of if ICE had a sense of where these like kingpin undocumented immigrants were, they would probably be in jail or deported already. But, as soon as you expand that net, you get people who look mighty sympathetic to kind of a normal audience.
And there's two additional points there. One, as you say, one of the key issues is that many people who are here undocumented have had children here. Their children are citizens. That is, despite what some people in the Trump orbit seem to think, that's not a policy decision. That's in the Constitution. They're U.S. citizens. And there was some Homans got asked about this in some setting recently, where kind of like, how are you going to pull that off? And he basically said something like, yeah, they got to go too, you know,
Yep.
the kids. So, and they, to the extent that they have said this explicitly, they seem to be their argument seems to be, we'll just do an executive order, and like then it's up to John Roberts if he wants, kind of. I don't think they're, in a sense, they're not even really disputing whether it's allowable. They're just saying Supreme Court will have our back or whatever. The other point is there's the optics part of it, but if you really, let's say, in a very dystopian hypothetical, let's say 2 calendar year, 24 months from now, 10 million people who are currently living and working in the United States are no longer in the United States. If you actually did that, given the reliance on the residential housing sector, on undocumented immigrants, and various other sectors, you would have like massive dislocations in the economy. It would make the housing market go haywire. It would drive up housing, building costs for new housing. So, in addition to, you know, children being sent into, mass, foundling homes for people who don't have their parents anymore, these kind of things that are in human terms horrific, you also have dimensions of this that in economic terms are horrific. So that's a lot to swallow. And I totally agree. There's no PR that, I mean, look, there is a big chunk of the country that will be totally fine with that happening, even with the bad video and stuff like that. A lot of the country that may be fine with it in concept will not be fine with seeing it actually happen. And I 100% agree with you. There's no PR. There's no PR. There's no like efficiently working White House that is going to get you around that. It's more that um, you're not going to have the other things where we got a big black eye because Trump woke up one day and got really mad at the manufacturers of ice cream, and then this just this kind of bonkers stuff that you sort of say like, that was just stupid and it didn't have anything to do with anything. And to the extent that he's doing these kind of lackeys, in in the cabinet departments, I think where this probably makes sense is you have people. Remember, there's no border czar. That's not a thing. That's just a made up name, and so it's not. It doesn't have to be confirmed or anything. That you've got him and Stephen Miller in the White House coming up with the game plan, calling up Kristi Noem. This is what we're gonna. This is what we need. And you pick someone like Kristi Noem because what they're going to hear back, they're going to, you got it, boss. You got it. Right? You're not talking about some kind of career Republican conservative or some ex-general who might be like, that's weird. Like, are you sure? All that kind of stuff. So all of it kind of makes sense. But you're not going to get around the blowback for that. There's people are going to see it and they're going to react, and exactly how they react, we have to wait and see. It's not going to be pretty. Either what we see is the reality of mass deportations or the blowback from
Yeah.
it. And,
I mean, the economic valence is ridiculous. Who's gonna guess who picks the food, in the fields that we eat? It's an overwhelmingly undocumented workforce. I mean, that sector of the economy would just absolutely collapse. I mean, it's those kind of things that make you wonder, are they really gonna make good on this? Or are they just gonna deport like a few more people than usual and really like highly publicize everyone they get who has any kind of black mark on their record to make it seem like, oh, we're rounding up the scum, right? I mean, it remains to be seen, but at least at this point they are putting in scary people in charge of immigration stuff, people who I have no doubt in my mind truly want every immigrant of color to not be in this country anymore.
yeah, and things like again, where you get into the stuff about not only are children inherently vulnerable, inherently sympathetic, but that's where you get into real constitutional stakes. These are U.S. citizens. People born in the United States are U.S. citizens. And with, all of the adults who are not citizens, who are here undocumented, there are legal processes that stand in that complicate their deportation. In some cases, there are practical consequences, but legally they have no right to be here. So there's no impediment, right? They can all be deported, and no one questions that. Again, there are processes that you have to go through. But if you're talking about deporting large numbers of American citizens, that is a very big constitutional thing beyond the inherently sympathetic character of a child being mistreated, separated from parents, et cetera, et cetera,
Right.
et cetera.
And they can come at this through all kinds of horrific ways, right? There have been some murmurings about them coming after temporary protected status, which is, basically what they grant people who are coming from countries that are so dangerous that you can't send them back there. Like Haitians are a good example of this. That country, has become so unstable and so violent that they're able to kind of stay under that status while things are adjudicated a bit easier than people who are coming from, vaguely less violent countries. So, we knew this going in, right? The horrors are could refract in any kind of direction. And you're totally right that as soon as you get onto a mass scale, you are going to have to deal with families that are mixed, that have some people who are undocumented and some who are citizens, and there are millions of them. So, we'll see how far he leans into kind of concretizing one of his biggest campaign promises.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that is that along with tariffs are the two things that if you really do them, it's not going to be like you could fire a ton of people at the NIH, and that will have big consequences going forward. But they will mostly not be consequences that people will say, wow, when we had that other, when we had the new epidemic in, 2034, things, we didn't have a lot of good scientists around to help us. People aren't going to connect those dots necessarily. But if you put 10% tariffs on everything, people notice that really fucking quickly. Right. That'll just be obvious because inflation's going to go through the roof. So those are two things where, regardless of what you think of the morality or the wisdom of them, people will notice. It's not gonna slip through the cracks if they happen. Then we'll see. We'll see what the response is. That's what history is.
All right.
Okay. Well, I think that is everything we have for the first episode back. Thank you for being with us, and we know it's been a pretty crummy week and a pretty draining week for a lot of people. So thank you for listening, and I think that's all we got for now.
We'll be here through the highs and the lows.
Yep. See you in a week.
All right. See you next week. The Josh Marshall Podcast is hosted by me, TPM reporter Kate Riga, and TPM founder, editor-in-chief Josh Marshall. The show is produced by Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to Why Not Jansfeld for our podcast theme song, and thanks to all our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and subscribe wherever you listen.